Kathleen and Pellegrini in her bringing us together, and also for making visible what I hadn't quite realized, which is that we have become the people whose offices we sat in on when we were students. Which is particularly alarming to me as the associate dean up here. I want to start off by asking, truthfully, like, how many people read the papers? Okay, then I will not. I wasn't asking you, like, I'm not going to call you out. You're dean. I won't talk from the paper. I'll talk about the context of the paper. But I also want to say something about this particular moment that was not true when we wrote the papers, which is that the protests in Wisconsin have begun since we wrote the papers. And I just want to note what a hopeful moment this is for a kind of resistance by public sector unions, by youth, by women, by allies, to the kinds of attacks on public higher education that I think many of us are here because we're interested in. So as I was rereading the paper and thinking about what I wanted to say today, one of the first things that struck me was that it sounded very deanish. That it seems to sort of articulate a position from the center, like, we own the university, and let's talk about how to use the resources that we have from the position at the center of the university. But I want to tell you that I didn't come to that voice from that position. In fact, what happened was, and this is the true story of how I became associate dean, after I had been department head of gender and women's studies for 2 weeks, the then dean put forward a proposal to reestablish the core of social and behavioral sciences. And that left out a whole bunch of units, from the college, including gender and women's studies, Mexican American studies, Judaic studies, Middle East studies, Near East studies, the Southwest Institute for Research on Women. And that was a kind of blueprint for moving forward. And at that point, the only thing I knew about being department head was that you didn't yell at the dean. And, and within minutes, I was on the phone yelling at the dean and saying, like hell, this is what's going to happen. And in fact, it isn't what happened. And part of why it didn't happen is we mobilized allies and resources like crazy. And we mobilized allies within the disciplines. And ultimately, we built community support. We, all the way up to the governor's office, and this is when it was Janet Napolitano, when that was still possible. And ultimately, well, we organized just about all the department heads in the university to look at the ways that the provost had created a mandate for shrinking that had caused this. And we beat it back. And what I learned from that was how to speak from the center, how to say, these units embody the values that matter to the university. And the kinds of units that are getting sort of compressed and beaten into submission are, in fact, your most important units. And to do it in a way that resonated, whether you were running a chemistry department or a philosophy department. We did, at some point, begin conversations about creating a difference unit of American Indian Studies, Africana Studies, Mexican American Studies, Gender and Women's Studies, and the Southwest Institute for Research on Women. And what we decided we wanted to do was really address some of the pressures to do that by proposing a curriculum change rather than administrative change. So yes, we can mobilize students in new ways, we can develop new kinds of courses and new kinds of collaborations, but we're going to do it not by destroying our units, because our units are the fundamental basis from which we think, and they provide necessary labor that mobilize the courses and the seats and so forth. So what I was trying to do in this piece, and I'm so grateful to our organizers for the question, how can we think about remaking the university that put our units and our values at the center, is I wanted to try to write a kind of manifesto about how we can think about ourselves as central. And to name the maybe good and bad uses to which we've been put, like managing the diversity of the university, and sort of taking up all those awkward populations that the university was not so sure if it wanted, but it understood that it had to have after World War II. So I do think we bring real resources to the table in terms of things like being relevant, that these are calls that are coming from outside the university as well as inside them. I think Lisa Duggan was right this morning to invoke Mark Taylor's model of sort of, let's name some problem areas and that they matter. Well, let's us name some problem areas and talk about how to turn those into curricular initiatives. But following Rod Ferguson's excellent example, I want to sort of now speak against myself and talk too about the importance of creating from the margins. That part of what's important about our units is also that they are marginal spaces, that they are spaces of dissent, that they are spaces where we can say things that are true, but not necessarily invited by the wider university. I think it's also interesting and a tribute to the organizers to notice that some of the dissent, or some of the spaces in which we're most optimistic about how to make curricular change, are places like Utah and Arizona and Riverside, that there's a lot to be said for being outside the immediate circuits of power. And then finally, one of the things I argue in the piece is that we can see that the budget is not actually, on the whole, getting smaller. The budget priorities are shifting, and they're shifting away in ways that make student access make students have much less access, that are hurting staff in particular. And I agree with much of what Lisa Duggan was saying this morning about this being a manufactured crisis. But I also want to stop and note a little bit about the ways that wealth is being transferred in ways that make this not so much a manufactured crisis. In other words, what are the actual holes and how are they being produced? And I just want to hold up that while we've been good about developing a discourse in public higher education about state allocation of resources, it's also a reality in Arizona that even had tax rates remain the same as they were in 2006, our budget would still be a third smaller. And the overall state budget, there's a real budget crisis that our legislators are dealing with. And that budget crisis is being produced through the foreclosure crisis. It's being produced by the banks. And I don't think that our students necessarily know or understand that their kinds of impoverishment, the impoverishment of lack of access to education, is significantly a result of the foreclosure crisis, which we have not done as good a job of mobilizing around as we might have. So So I'll leave it at that with those comments.